All right, Sam Miller, finally got him here. Sam Miller Science. He is my go-to information for, let's say, functional health, right? Hormonal health, and also metabolic function. I'm actually taking his course now. We'll talk a little bit about that further on. But Sam, how you doing, bro?
I appreciate you having me, man. It's good to be on.
I was just talking about the ambiance that he has in the background there. It's making me feel real calm. I have red, so I'm obviously my guy Jared likes to make me red over here. But you got the nice, like,
you got the red, I got the blue.
Yeah,
combine it. We can have like a little America vibe going on.
I thought you was coming with some more science, like some more chemistry with the red and the blue coming together. I don't know.
That was very much just kind of basic colors that we learned in elementary school. But, I'll try harder next time.
Got it, bro. So what's been going on, man? What are you doing now?
So I am, aside from just kind of running the FNMS program for coaches, I'm wrapping up my first book. I've done ebooks before, but I have a book called Metabolism Made Simple that's going to drop this fall on Amazon. So that's just been keeping me busy, a lot of back and forth in terms of final editing and different, cover options and, things you would never think of. It's literally, probably more intensive than, I've seen friends when they're planning a wedding, and I feel like the equivalent of like every last like environmental thing, table setting, it's like planning an event, but also you have this thing that's going to be this like living piece of knowledge that's coming out into the world. So I'm excited to be done with it, number one, but it has been keeping me pretty busy outside of the work that we do with coaches. So primarily just that and the podcast, man. So that's kind of my main focus right now. But I'll be excited to get that book wrapped up. Done some ebooks and stuff before, but the whole aspect of like print and distribution, having a physical copy just adds another dimension that's completely different from anything else that I've done before. Gotcha.
Now, you've been in the industry for about 15 years now, right? So let's take it back a little bit for the people that may not know.
I started off, so it's probably right around 15 to 17. I started off as a personal trainer, got my CPT background. I kind of got the itch with lifting, performance training, and even started getting interest in nutrition around that time as well. I was just always active in high school, and started more on the CPT side. And I ended up venturing more into nutrition, physiology, endocrinology based on some of my interests. And also, I had a pretty bad concussion when I was younger. And so that TBI really led me down the rabbit hole of learning more about how the body works and why it responds in certain ways to various stressors or physical injuries and things and different adaptations you may see to the hormonal system. So I started off just kind of your basic training, learning things in the gym. Obviously, the information we have and the way we would approach things has changed so much over the years, where I look back and I'm like, some of the stuff we were doing over 10 years ago, I'm like, man, that was definitely not the best way to do it, but you live and you learn. So now my main focus is primarily nutrition, metabolism, physiology, and figuring out like health optimization for coaches who are working with both lifestyle clients and athletes, and that has really varied across the board. And I've been brought in on different cases to consult for whether it's someone who's more on the performance side. I know you work with fighters, and then also have done some health consultations for folks who are maybe more on the bodybuilding side, where there's some things changing in their blood chemistry or their lab values that they're trying to get a hold of. So I've been involved with that as well. But I just kind of got the itch based on my own sort of health journey and experience that I had. But I kept seeing clients that were kind of coming into my coaching practice, and I felt like there was just more to the story than your basic kind of sets, reps, calories. Those are a good foundation if you are brand new to the health and fitness world. But you reach a point as a coach where you're like, I think we can go a little bit beyond this. Maybe there's something else that I kind of need to dig into in order to really help these people, especially when we're looking at a higher level of performance that requires, not just what we look at in terms of like normal reference range labs or normal recovery, when people are pushing their bodies in a more extreme way. And that really just fascinated me and kind of sent me down this path of continued learning, and ultimately resulted in building the program that we have for coaches and health professionals today.
Yeah, so when you're looking at, let's say for instance, a client, and they come in to you, I know you work with a lot of coaches now, but what's the basic foundation of what you want to look for from a biofeedback standpoint? What's like the first go-to
Yeah, so I always do an intake form and a food log with everybody, whether they're an athlete or, a grandma that's just trying to like get her health markers improved because she wants to live to see like little Timmy's birthday, regardless of whether it's optimal performance, longevity, aesthetic goals. I think it's super important for coaches to have a solid intake form. Yep. Biofeedback wise, my little acronym for remembering this is SHRED. So sleep, hunger, recovery, energy, digestion, and stress. The reason I prioritized those specifically is because when those tend to be off, that can impact our nutritional decisions, it can impact our training performance, and subsequently you'll see changes in your physiology where it impacts your lab values. So I like to start with that foundation. And if you notice, hey, recovery's off or energy seems low or there's a bit of fatigue, then we can adjust the training program or adjust the nutrition program or, their stress management and figure out, okay, how do we get this back on track? And how do we put this in a place where this person can, be as successful as possible? So I like to start with those as kind of my baseline. Now, granted, someone who maybe has a 9-to-5, that's going to be a different type of intake form than someone who's maybe, a fighter, like some of the guys you work with, or you've had some different performers and stuff where maybe their lifestyle looks a little bit different. Yeah. But it is important to have that lifestyle questionnaire. And then from there, getting a real pulse on like, how do you currently feel? What is your quality of life like? And then how do we improve that realistically, starting kind of one category at a time and really knocking that out one by one. But pretty much, regardless across the board, whether lifestyle or performance client, it's imperative to start with both. Let's take a look at that full nutritional inventory, what they're doing with their training, and then get some baseline biofeedback, which is as simple as, having a conversation with them and getting them to track some things across the week. So
when it comes to male and female, I've had a fighter that I work with. Her name is Megan Anderson, and we were talking about fight camps, and menstrual cycles, right? And the different phases of the menstrual cycle. Can you explain a little bit more about like what a female actually goes through in that cycle phase and what you should be doing from a training perspective and a nutrition standpoint to help optimize performance and progression going further?
Sure. So this is definitely individual. More intermediate to advanced athletes who are really, they have their adherence on point. It's not for your beginner client. Yeah. Someone who is, more like the client that you outlined is going to benefit from this type of particular plan. But when we look at follicular phase and luteal phase physiology, which is what happens across the menstrual cycle, we have to understand is that there are different hormones present in different concentrations at different times. And then as a result of those different hormonal concentrations at different times, that can impact overall performance, quality of life, and even just how someone feels in terms of their basic mood and overall drive and desire to train, in addition to the actual performance they have during the exercise activity itself. So the follicular phase, what we see is that estrogen is a little bit more prevalent during that time period. And this is the time period in the follicular phases leading up to ovulation, whereas luteal phase, think luteal last, follicular first. So follicular phase prior to ovulation, luteal phase coming afterwards. Now, the luteal phase, that's characterized by progesterone kind of comes out to play in the luteal phase and is more prevalent than it is in the follicular phase. Now, that change in hormonal balance can impact how you feel and subsequent recovery and overall just desire to train and go into the gym. Now, whether women need to periodize or account for this is somewhat individual, but we do have more research. There was a recent study both in March and June of this year. We're starting to have more exercise physiology research on women because for such a long period of time, up to the year 2000, many of the studies were actually on men. Yeah. Or we would have studies where it was men and women combined. We wouldn't just specifically be studying women in terms of the implications of training, nutrition, and the menstrual cycle. Gotcha. So we do have some slight differences as a result of estrogen being around, a little bit more prevalent in the follicular phase. That can influence things like overall carbohydrate metabolism, insulin sensitivity. The luteal phase, we tend to have a little bit of like very, very mild insulin resistance. Now, obviously, if you're consistent with your nutrition, your overall behaviors, it's not going to be like a game changer or completely break things, but it is important to be cognizant of that because it can impact what you might do with an advanced client overall. As far as what we know in women is estrogen is incredibly important for not only muscle building, but also bone health. And, what we may see with some clients who are doing more advanced training, like the fighter that you mentioned, she might actually notice that her performance is a little bit better, maybe mid-follicular phase leading up to ovulation, or maybe, just after, once she gets over the hump or the first few days of her cycle, that portion of the follicular phase leading into that, maybe even into early luteal might be her best training window. And then what you might notice is, hey, maybe we need to do more mobility in the luteal phase. Maybe we need to kind of back it down in terms of overall training output. Maybe we're doing a little bit of, moderate intensity cardio or conditioning in that luteal phase. That is a possibility. I think we do need a little bit more research on athletes to kind of validate this. But what I have noticed working with both client populations, and if you just think about what the hormones themselves are doing, it does sort of make sense looking at the client biofeedback and then looking at the training program and figuring out, okay, we might want to adjust things a little bit nutritionally and a little bit from a training perspective. So for a higher level athlete, that might mean, okay, maybe we have an increased training frequency and maybe, slight change in reps in reserve or RPE during a portion of the cycle, and then potentially backing off a little bit, maybe doing more maintenance volume or more minimum effective dose.
In the luteal phase, right? In the luteal phase?
Maybe some, mobility and stuff in the luteal phase as well. And then kind of adjusting nutrition accordingly based on their activity level.
Now, are we looking at was it 15 to 16 days from the initial follicular phase to the luteal phase?
So not all women necessarily ovulate at the exact same time. If you are working with female athletes, what I would suggest doing is a basal body temperature reading in the morning and just put it right by the nightstand or by your toothbrush, and then have it stack it with something you already do. So if you usually wake up to an alarm, put the thermometer right there, just take your oral temperature first thing in the morning. Oura Ring is also developing some technology to help women monitor their body temperature relative to their cycle. I'm not affiliated with them in any way. It's just some women don't necessarily go about taking their temperature with a thermometer. I'd recommend do that first just to get a pulse on it, and then compare it and monitor the trends relative to an Oura Ring or something like that. If you have the tool, can be an option for sleep and recovery, but it's not necessary. So what I would first do is track with a basal, use basal body temperature readings to track your cycle. And they can also pay attention to things related to, kind of working back from previous cycles, or if they wanted to incorporate lab work, to kind of monitor where their peak progesterone is and things in the luteal phase, which usually is around kind of that 19 to 21. For some women, it may be a little bit later if they have longer cycles, but typically, follicular phase, if you wanted to be super textbook with it and very much just use this example in isolation, probably looking at first 14 days follicular, 14 to 28 would be more your luteal. Some people argue that there's sort of sub phases within those phases, and they'll divide it into 4. So they'll have kind of a early follicular, and then mid to late follicular, and then they'll have early luteal to late. But the main concept here, if you had 4 weeks, 28 days, and you divide it out, it's going to be roughly half falling follicular, half luteal. Now that's textbook example. Some women will vary. So the most important thing to do, monitor your body temperature and your symptoms and biofeedback, because that's going to give you the best pulse on what's going on.
Yeah, that gives me because I've been working through that with a couple of my female fighters, and that's based off of the knowledge that I got from you, and actually getting their body temperature in the morning, and also when they go to weight cut too as well. It's a big thing. So if they're whatever phase they're in, if they have to weight cut in that particular phase, then we have to monitor training, we have to monitor your sleep, we have to monitor your diet, obviously, and then again, just making sure that we're staying along the lines of your hormonal balance too as well, and how they're feeling. So I use shreds all the time.
If they're very, very lean and they have to cut weight classes, there is a chance they may temporarily lose their cycle for a short period of time, or maybe just one cycle. If they are weight cutting and trying to make weight in the luteal phase, that you may see a little bit of water retention impacting that scale weight. Usually once a woman has gone through her cycle and we see the period start, typically there is a bit of a weight drop after that versus what's going on leading up to that period. So then after that time, once we get back into the follicular phase, we do tend to see that weight drop again. And that's important both for athletes and lifestyle clients too, is rather than just looking week to week only at your weight, monitor week 1 of cycle 1 to week 1 of cycle 2. So for example, 4 weeks after that. So week 1 to week 1, week 2 to week 2, week 3 to week 3, 4 to 4, because otherwise you'll drive yourself nuts. If you're in week 3 of a month and you're comparing your weight from your luteal phase to, your follicular phase when you felt your best, naturally your weight might be a little bit up, you get in your head, and then all of a sudden it starts to impact your performance and how you feel about yourself. And it turns into more of a mental thing if they don't understand how to actually monitor those variables. So that's the biggest thing, is just knowing what to do with the data. And I see a lot of coaches where they're not even tracking that for a client. So then the client gets tripped up because they think they've messed up, when in reality their body's just holding a little bit of water.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a big thing when it comes to psychologically with fighters, especially female fighters. And no disrespect to female fighters, but we all know how they are with their weight. Don't get me canceled here. But no.
I feel like a lot of athletes, I mean,
it's every athlete for sure.
Sometimes have a hard time with their weight.
Absolutely.
I think for women, those fluctuations can be challenging. It can be, it can feel a little bit like a mind game. You're like, man, I'm working hard. Why is my weight climbing? Why is my weight going up? I feel like my calories are down and my activity's up. What's going on? And you just start to second guess things, and that can be really frustrating from a mental perspective. So it's understandable, but we definitely see that, both with male and female clients, but especially I think it can be challenging for female athletes for sure.
Another thing that can disrupt weight change or weight loss and fluctuations in weight is cortisol. And can you explain a little bit more, male and female, what happens with elevated cortisol for a sustained amount of time? I work with SWAT guys, I work with the fighters. They're always on high alert. So can you explain, one, what is cortisol? And then also, what can we do to combat that high cortisol or just sustain cortisol throughout, a time frame?
For sure. So cortisol is usually classified as a quote unquote stress hormone. Now, the challenge of that is then people, see it on an infomercial and they think cortisol is all bad, but cortisol actually is super important for our daily diurnal rhythm. And we have what's called a cortisol awakening response each and every morning, or at least you should, in a healthy individual. And then we have a nice slope or taper to where at the end of the day, cortisol sort of winds down, and we have our melatonin production that's helpful for overall maintenance of healthy sleep hygiene and maintaining our sort of biological clock each day. So when I use terms like circadian rhythm or diurnal rhythm, that really just means biological clock or sort of daily schedule for our body. Cortisol can become elevated during, or heightened during times of stress. You think about a fight or flight response. So if you have a stressful experience, that could be related to work. That could be if you are a night shift worker and you are working sort of opposite hours from what your body is used to, that can elicit a stress response as well. We also have to remember that cortisol does play a role in blood sugar regulation. So when you spend a lot of time in fasted state physiology, or overall, just think about a hypocaloric state, meaning when your calories are very low, our body is going to rely on that physiology, which is cortisol, glucagon, and catecholamines, to help regulate your blood sugar. Those are just hormones and basically chemical messengers or signals that are working with your body. It is a bit of an alertness response. So we have to remember when we're talking about HPA axis function, we have both the fight or flight response, but we're also regulating sort of this feast or famine response as well. So when we're in times of, fasted state physiology or famine, AKA there's not a ton of food around, or low calorie state, low energy availability, our body does things hormonally to account for that and to regulate for that. Now in the SWAT example, in the fighter example, or just people under high stress, typically what we're seeing is elevated cortisol for a period of time. But if someone works like night shift for their whole career, or they're a first responder, or they're SWAT, or they're military, because they're in a higher stress environment, that kind of continues over time. It's perpetual. It's a chronic stressor and a more imminent threat. And we're talking about life or death situations that's very different than someone who works a desk job and has a stressful email from their boss. We're literally talking about people who might be dealing with, hand-to-hand combat, gunfire, things that are very stressful. Or I've worked with, different firefighters over the years and things where they're literally running into a burning building. Those are situations where, they might be waking up in the middle of the night. They have some sort of call. They're on call. They're running to these situations, these emergency situations, and that obviously can wreak havoc in terms of your body's physiological function. So depending on the role itself in terms of the work environment that they have, we may sort of have different interventions nutritionally or from a stress perspective. And what we notice is body tends to need a little bit more, especially when there's increased stress or HPA axis activation. Now, for general clients and athletes, understand cortisol is not all bad. You need some for performance. If you had super low cortisol, you'd feel flat. You wouldn't really feel great. You need a little bit in terms of your training session. But when we don't manage that cortisol, and this would be even for folks who are not working SWAT or military or firefighters or anything like that, even for the performance-oriented client, we still want to manage cortisol, because if it's not managed, it can impact muscle protein breakdown, and we're essentially in more of a catabolic state. So instead of having enough anabolism to essentially build muscle, have muscle protein synthesis, we're in a state of more muscle wasting and breaking things down, which certainly is not good if we're looking for muscle building, peak performance, and feeling our best overall on a day-to-day basis.
Now, with the guys that I train, and most of them are going to train at night at high intensities, and also compete at night in high intensities. When they do that for a sustained amount of time, can you talk a little bit about flip circadian rhythms and like cortisol shutdown in a sense? Like, what happens over time?
Yeah, so when you continually have cortisol basically being elevated, or we're elevating it maybe at inopportune times, it can start to impact our sleep patterns and overall sleep cycle. So one of the biggest things is, if someone is fighting or training in the evening, how do we get them to kind of come back down? Also, a big conversation here is, are we relying on stimulants and caffeine as kind of uppers in the evening pre-training, which is then impacting sleep as well? And then we certainly need to think about body temperature. So one thing a lot of folks forget in terms of our circadian biology and diurnal rhythm is that we may have elevated body temperature after training. This is why sometimes you might go train in the evening, you've got a great session, you just have a really hard time cooling down, getting ready for bed. Now, for optimal sleep, we need a cool, dark environment. So if we ourselves are already pretty warm, and then we have a hard time kind of bringing that down, plus we had a lot of central nervous system stimulation, we're now in a situation where we're not exactly ready for bed per se. So you could use a combination of, you could do kind of post-training, a little bit of mobility, breath work, foam rolling, things that are a little bit more restorative in nature, or try to move that training session up if you can. Obviously, there may be some prime time events where these individuals do have to be prepared to fight in the evening or have training that's going on in the evening. Other tools or modalities you could look at would be things like contrast hydrotherapy, seeing how they respond to either warm or cold. People may respond differently in terms of how it impacts their sleep. The post-training meal is going to be very important, using carbohydrates and insulin to bring down that cortisol. You can also look to use different adaptogens, or things like theanine is more of a calming amino acid. Glycine can help with kind of bringing things back into balance from a circadian perspective. It's also mildly hypothermic. So there's a couple cool studies on glycine as an amino acid. I actually use it both with athletes and menopausal clients, which is like opposite populations for sure, but it can be really helpful in that sense to kind of combine those. But as far as your basic foundations, it's going to be, what are you doing post-training? Can you go for a walk? Can you, just breathe, do some basic recovery techniques? Then when you go home, maybe it's a combination. Maybe you do a little bit of contrast hydrotherapy, get a good solid meal in. We don't want people, especially athletes, who are like afraid of carbs at night or afraid of getting food down at night. You need to get that food in and prep for the next day's training session. You can also use carbohydrate intra-training and post-training to help prevent as much of a cortisol spike, relying a little bit more on glucose and essentially having that insulin to be counter-regulatory to cortisol in that instance. So that's kind of a way that I would think about managing a situation like that. It's still very challenging. It may not be optimal, but we want to mitigate, that additional stress as much as possible to ensure the best possible recovery for performance the next day, and just ongoing training cycles, especially in a situation like a fight camp.
Yeah. So I was thinking, because like at the end, like I do like to take, like if I'll train at night, and I train jiu-jitsu still at night, I'll take a cold shower to cool my body off. And then I'll do some form of, obviously I'll have some protein, and I'll do some form of stretching. What type of carbohydrates? You're talking glucose and fructose, or just glucose?
So technically post-training, you can the little hack is you can actually use a combination of a starch and a fruit to actually use multiple glucose transporters if you wanted to. So an example is, maybe you have rice, and maybe you have like honey or fruit with that, like rice and pineapple, or maybe you have oats and berries or something, depending on their nutritional needs and the volume that they need to hit in that meal. It's going to be hard to get like 200 carbs from oats and berries, versus if you need to get a lot of carbs down, a relatively easy to digest, fairly hypoallergenic meal would be something like a jasmine rice, and maybe they have a little bit of honey or pineapple or something like that. The pineapple is also going to have bromelain. If they are having any protein content in that meal, you can little nutritional hack there. You can combine some of those together. So depending on their nutritional needs, you can adjust the carbohydrate content. If they're, training for long duration in that session, and they're in a phase where they need to maintain higher carbohydrate intake, you could also look at something like more of a powdered carbohydrate actually during and post-training, something that's a little bit faster acting or having essentially higher molecular weight, lower osmolarity to ensure gastric emptying, especially if they're worried about being bloated or having any sort of distension prior to sleep. So what I would do is, you could look at maybe even having some intra-workout nutrition, maybe have a solid meal when you go home. You could do like a little walk if you wanted to, or something that's going to be light to help with digestion, depending on the volume and overall kind of caloric burden of that meal. I do like the idea of either incorporating shower, stretching, basic things that are just going to help you kind of bring you back down. And for everybody, that's different. There's not one stress management modality that works for everyone. For someone, it might be music, it might be art, it might be breath work, it might be nature. Maybe you just sit outside. Like, there's not necessarily one strategy that I've used with every single client, but ideally you'd want to pick, okay, what's one nutritional strategy, one lifestyle strategy, and then maybe we're doing something to help with the body temperature aspect of being kind of overheated from training. And if we can hit 2 or 3 of those things, if someone's an athlete that you've never worked before, probably not going to throw 3 to 5 things at them at once. Let's start with 1 or 2, execute those, and then stack something on top of it. And then over time, their recovery will improve. And ideally, we're getting better sleep, which should improve subsequent training sessions after that.
Cool. All right. So this kind of follows along that line, because we talked about this off the recording, but operator syndrome, right? I have military guys, ex-combat veterans, that come back and they have PTSD and high stress levels for a sustained amount of time, just like the cortisol we talked about. Can you give an example of what that actually is so that they understand it, and then how can we combat that going further?
Yeah, for sure. So the way operator syndrome is kind of defined in more of the medical world is basically when you have high allostatic load, or we're thinking about physiological stressors, there's neural stressors, and it's basically a response of our nervous system and endocrine system from prolonged chronic stress. And usually we see this in a demanding career, whether that's military special forces, first responders. I have seen some other kind of high stress situations where, maybe it's like air traffic control or something at a really high traffic airport, but it's a situation where they're experiencing a large amount of stress throughout their career. And it is not necessarily a stressor that is acute in nature, meaning it kind of comes and goes. This is something that they're constantly exposed to over time. And then depending on both the ability to recover from that stressor, nutritional status, and parasympathetic inputs in combination with the accumulation of this physical and physiological stress, we'll see this kind of happen over time. So now operator syndrome basically can lead to HPA axis dysfunction that we talked about earlier. But if they are constantly under fight or flight and they have high cortisol during some of these instances during their career, you will eventually see a progression towards adrenal insufficiency. And this doesn't happen in every single individual, but basically we start with higher cortisol, and then that will essentially taper down to where eventually someone may actually have low cortisol. And this is because of the prolonged stressor. So their body has basically gone from, okay, I'm trying to adapt to the stimulus, to then it's basically like, WTF, what is this stimulus? I don't want to deal with this anymore. It lowers cortisol over time as basically a ramification of that prolonged stress. So with operator syndrome, it can be detrimental not only in terms of HPA axis function, but especially in male clients, can subsequently lead to things like low testosterone, micronutrient deficiencies, GI issues. So it can really go hand in hand with a lot of other problems, which is why it's important to have an understanding of kind of the career background, the level of stress, and it's something that you can use lab work to kind of identify mental status in terms of where someone is overall.
Okay, yeah, because it makes a lot of sense, right? When you have that, almost that elevation, and then when they come down, a lot of times they can't get back to where they felt like they wanted to be or where they were, and then you have a large amount of depression that goes along with that, which leads to psychological issues going further. So that's a big issue in I know in the military world, and that's something that we're trying to combat. We're trying to get better. Now, when you talk about, let's go back to that HPA axis. Can you explain a little bit more to people that don't know what that is and kind of go into detail on why that's important?
Yeah, definitely. So HPA axis is basically the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis. Now, you're not going to want to say it 10 times fast. I didn't even want to say it 2 times fast because I haven't tripped over my words and I've been studying this for a long time. But it's basically, simply put, the connection between your brain and your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands are essentially these tiny glands that sit near your kidneys. And they produce corticosteroids. So that is where cortisol is produced. And so the communication between the brain and the adrenals, that signaling, essentially when we're under stress, your brain is perceiving that stressor, that imminent threat, and it is signaling the adrenals to have the subsequent hormonal output. So if you're constantly under stress, what we may see over time is it's not so much that you'll hear terms thrown out like adrenal fatigue, right? But it's your actual adrenal glands are not tired per se. Your brain is just kind of fed up with the situation and adapts to it to where you end up with a change in cortisol output from the adrenals, but a lot of it has to do with the brain's regulation of hormones, because the brain is kind of the governor, the captain, or the coach of the situation, and it's basically modulating hormonal output as a result of those stressors. So HPA is just a big scientific word in the endocrinology world to describe essentially your brain, that hypothalamus communicating with the pituitary, and then the pituitary basically communicating with the adrenals. But as long as you understand that basically, hey, my brain communicates to these different glands that then produce different hormones, makes it way easier to understand, far less overwhelming that way. And then what we really just need to understand is, okay, how do we create a situation for athletes or for clients where we get the brain to essentially have lower perceived stress, or just like lessen the training demands, or lessen the lifestyle demands, or even from a nutritional perspective, if we're in a hypocaloric state for a long period of time, that low calorie chronic dieting, that's also a perceived stressor as well, right? So we're just thinking about what inputs are we sort of signaling to the brain, and how is that affecting the hormonal adaptations that follow? And that sort of whole area of study or science is really just referred to as adaptive physiology. Basically, how does our body adapt to its environment, nutritional stimulus, training, things like that. And that's a lot of the stuff that, I talk about, and we've obviously kind of gone back and forth on, over the past few months.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna take almost a step towards more of the diet side of things, because it's a lot of bullshit out there, and I know that you can clear it up for me. Now, as far as, let's just go into the fad diets, right? You got the carnivore diet, right? You got vegan, you got the keto diet, all of that. For a large amount of time, a lot of people were afraid of cholesterol, and that's really where that whole carnivore thing started to take its rise. Right now they're saying that cholesterol isn't bad for you. Can you explain exactly what is cholesterol and why it's important for hormonal function and also everything else that functions the body?
Yeah, for sure. So I think when we talk about fad diets, right, what we first have to understand is usually with most of the fad diets, they're essentially eliminating a food group or a type of food that also reduces calories. So when people do that, that impacts their net change in weight. But when we do remove entire food groups, there might be some nutritional consequences. So for example, with carnivore, that lack of carbohydrate might not be ideal for a fighter that we're talking about in this scenario, right? Or maybe if they're looking to optimize testosterone level, the lack of carbs leads to elevated SHBG, which is a binding protein that impacts our free testosterone. Not super great if we're looking to optimize male hormone function and quality of life. But, some people feel good with it and they choose to follow that, and that's what they can adhere to. So they follow that particular nutritional practice. You have seen a lot of folks in carnivore even adding carbohydrate from fruit or honey, just basic sort of practices to help get a little bit of insulin release to bring that SHBG down. So just speaking to fad diets, whether it's carnivore or otherwise, there are a lot of different dietary practices out there. And with some slight tweaks, you can make them significantly more balanced from a nutritional perspective. And this is why it's also important to get your lab testing so you could see, hey, when I completely eliminate carbohydrates, this is what happens in terms of my internal physiology, sort of my metabolic status quo. And we're all sort of individuals with different health histories, different past diets, different personal preferences, different performance goals, different psychology. All of that plays into what diet is going to be best for us. Now, in terms of the cholesterol conversation, when we think about cholesterol, it's essentially a building block for steroid hormones. So mainly when people think about cholesterol and hormone production, they're usually referring to reproductive hormone function, whether they realize it or not. So other hormones in the body, like thyroid, for example, they don't necessarily have a cholesterol base. But cholesterol becomes pregnenolone, which is basically our mother hormone. And then from there, that's how you end up with things like testosterone, estradiol. Those are essentially our sex steroids that people talk about, or sex hormones. So when we're thinking about steroid hormones, that has a cholesterol base. Now, cholesterol was demonized, especially like our parents' generation, grandparents, mainstream media sort of picked on cholesterol as a problem child. We have to understand is cholesterol is important for physiological function. And even if you don't obtain it from the diet, it's literally so important. Your liver actually makes cholesterol as well. So when we're getting dietary cholesterol, we need to be mindful that depending on the person, just because you consume that cholesterol doesn't necessarily mean, oh my God, my cholesterol shot up and now I have high cholesterol. We also have new emerging information around cholesterol and heart disease. So if you are interested in cardiovascular risk markers, you'd be much better served looking at a different, more expansive panel, more specific panel for CVD, which is cardiovascular disease, and looking at your overall cardiometabolic health and inflammation, as opposed to hyper focusing only on LDL, HDL, and total cholesterol. Because what we learned is even the traditional reference ranges are slightly skewed relative to, like, if we look at reviews or basically recent research on cholesterol in humans, we actually see that the optimum mortality data, or like best lifespan data, actually comes at a slightly higher point than what people initially expected. Like, people used to want you to be, get your LDL as low as possible, but that's actually not true. We have kind of a Goldilocks amount when it comes to cholesterol. And we can also be looking at things like ratio of triglycerides and cholesterol, looking at C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker, looking at fasting insulin and other markers of metabolic health, as opposed to just having that granular focus on cholesterol. So biggest takeaway here, understand, for hormone production, you don't want to go like super low fat diet or completely eliminate cholesterol. And also part of that too is just when you eliminate fat, you're removing 9 calories per gram. That reduces energy availability dramatically. And if you have performance goals, going on a low calorie diet is going to be detrimental to that performance and hormonal output. So that's kind of a reason for dietary fat. And then cholesterol is going to help serve as part of that overall synthesis of things like testosterone, which we've talked about in today's podcast.
Yeah, perfect. That was great. So I would say that, for me, looking at it from a broad spectrum, you always have to be subjective, right? So everything that we put in our body is based upon the individual's needs, but also based upon the lab testing, right? And the biofeedback that you get. So make sure you guys know that. Anyways, I made it more clear and simplified than what you just did. I'm just kidding. You're the man.
I can always break it down a little bit.
No, I'm fucking with you. I'm kidding.
I would just say it would be hard to understand your cholesterol markers based on biofeedback, but I do agree for sure. Lab testing. If you have any type of family history like I do, for example, my dad actually just had his 3rd stent. He's got a bypass and a pacemaker. So you best believe I check my cardiovascular markers regularly, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions if people has them, or if they have them, or if there's any family risk factors or you're trying to hedge against that. Also have a number of different podcasts on that particular topic, which we can cover a little bit towards the end as well. So I would just say, if anyone's interested, do your due diligence in that area. There's a lot of antiquated information that is not necessarily serving, sort of optimal nutritional practices in 2022. A lot of the information sort of came out in like the 1980s, and, people like our parents and our grandparents, and, they demonize basically whole foods. and saying that they're bad. And really what we need to do is we should get serum labs, see where we are as, individuals who are mindful of our health, and then track that over time and see how our nutrition impacts that and how our lifestyle impacts that. And that's really going to be the best way to go.
No doubt. Now, me and you both have had our fair share. You had TBI, you had traumatic brain injury, and I've had my fair share of concussions. What are some of the things that you've been able to do to combat that, as far as, getting back to like full homeostasis and making sure that your body is back to functioning the way it needs to?
For sure. So I wish I knew earlier really the connection between the brain and gut health, also in understanding more about nutrition and inflammation. So at the time when I essentially had a concussion, I wasn't necessarily fueling the way that I should have, and I was already an athlete who was kind of under eating. So then you add in any type of physical injury and you're under recovering, you're not fueling appropriately. I didn't really understand as much about, omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratios. I didn't know what I know today about gut health. Prioritizing that, we have essentially gut-brain connection, where if you are mindful of, your overall gut health, you can get inflammation under control. You can optimize omega-3 status. There's so many things we can do for brain health now that I think we just weren't aware of years ago, right? So this was, I was in my teens, and there's no way, now I'm 33. So there's just so much information that we have related to head injuries that we did not have when I was younger. And so my biggest advice would be, if you are someone that's had a head injury, get your serum labs tested, look at your hormonal profile. It is totally possible you may have some aberrations as a result of that head injury. And then just keep an eye on things, related to your gut health. If you notice any changes in your digestion, also keep an eye on brain fog, fatigue, things like that, to make sure that you can recover appropriately. And then this is really where, nutrition can come into play and make sure you're fueling for recovery, but also, optimize your fatty acid intake and, doing what you can, as far as the variables that you can control. There's some additional sort of supplementation out there where, if I was working with more people specifically that had those head injuries, probably dive into it a little bit more. But as far as omega-3 fatty acids, DHA intake, DHA and EPA, rich omega-3 fish oils are going to be a great option. And then anything that just helps your body modulate inflammation naturally is going to be a great way to go in terms of head injuries. And then based on, your lab work, you can essentially decide, okay, this is what's going to be best for me based on how my body's responded to this particular injury or insult.
Have you seen any of the research on creatine monohydrate with the onset of traumatic brain injury?
Yeah, so creatine's great for brain health, not just for TBIs, but it's great as a preventive mechanism in terms of neurological decline, potentially even for neuroinflammation and depression. Creatine's also great for supporting methylation. So honestly, regardless of whether you got a TBI or not, creatine is a great supplement. It was actually super affordable until we had some supply chain issues that Phil and I were talking about recently. But as far as outside of that, creatine is great, not only for sports performance, which is where a lot of people give it a lot of love, is in the sports performance world, but it's actually amazing, even our grandparents can be taking creatine from like a overall mental cognitive health perspective. And, just making sure that we're preventing that cognitive decline. It serves in, that methylation process as well that I mentioned. So many great benefits to creatine, and, TBIs could be a potential use case for them, but really even healthy individuals without any sort of injury could benefit in terms of their brain health and creatine as well.
Yeah, no, this is definitely something that we throw in there, especially like pre-sparring. Right? We'll do like 2.5 grams and then another 2.5 grams. It's definitely helped as far as that goes, but again, creatine is like the super supplement in a lot of ways, Now,
for sure.
As far as gut health goes, can you explain exactly like how much the gut plays a role in connected to the brain and the functioning of the brain and how it's both connected together?
For sure. So in terms of how you feel on a daily basis, one of the biggest things we see with folks in kind of a Western world is the standard American diet tends to increase intestinal permeability. And this is a combination of hypercaloric foods, low micronutrient density, and essentially creating more of an inflammatory state in the body. When we have gut dysbiosis and intestinal permeability, gut dysbiosis is just a big word to say we got more bad bacteria than good bacteria. We want the good bacteria. So essentially when we end up with that poor relationship or essentially unfavorable sort of balance in the gut or in the microbiome, that is inherently inflammatory and then also contributes to sort of the state of intestinal permeability. That basically just means if you're watching this video, if I had my hands interlocked and I were to space that, they were slowly pulled apart to where the tight junctions in the gut became open, or you could stick your finger or like a pencil between my interlocked fingers, it goes from being essentially having this sort of semi-permeable effect to it to having a compromise or being in a place where we no longer have that integrity from the perspective of the tight junctions. So we want, good tight junction function, good mucosal barrier function. And so when we don't have that, things that belong in the gut that are supposed to stay in the gut and be digested actually seep into circulation. And then as a result of that, that leads to immune system activation. And that is an additional stressor on the body as well. So that's actually a precursor and plays a role in terms of autoimmunity. But if we're looking at athletes, if we see that intestinal permeability, that could compromise recovery. It's going to activate the immune system, and it can compromise hormonal function, as well as, things like thyroid as well. So for like your average person, where that's probably showing up in terms of how they feel is probably in their hormonal function and impaired micronutrient status. When we have impaired micronutrient status, that's going to make us less resilient to stress as well. So first and foremost, with the gut, we have to think, hey, this is where we're absorbing our nutrients, and a compromised gut means compromised nutrient absorption. There's a symbiotic relationship between micronutrients and the microbiome. So when we have impaired nutrient status, that's instantly going to make our gut health worse. And gut health in a poor place is going to make our micronutrient status worse. So that's recipe for disaster number one. Then those micronutrients are imperative for hormonal function and how we feel and how our body sort of copes with stress, and just a number of enzymatic functions and reactions that are necessary in the body. Also think about your electrolyte status for your athletes, things like magnesium, all sorts of different implications there in terms of vitamins and minerals. And then moving beyond that, that inflammation, immune activation, things like that, that's going to impact how you feel as well. So it just sort of creates this slippery slope where the gut is just so connected to a number of other functions in the body. And when we have any sort of, aberration in gut function, that's going to start to show up downstream in terms of things like hormones, and it does impact what's happening in terms of even something as basic as our food and what we're able to actually absorb from that food. So as basic as our nutrition to as complicated as our immune system, it's just involved in so many different facets of overall health and performance.
Can you give like a basic, I want to say, outline or identification to exactly how your gut is functioning, whether it be tests, like a Dutch test or like a gut microbiome test, and then also like understanding what you're putting into your body? Just kind of give them a basic outline.
A really easy way to start is first, just thinking about, am I having good digestion, which for most people means they're going, ideally daily, once per day. If they're going multiple times per day. Ideally, we're not going more than 3 times per day, and we're not going less than 3 times per week. If we're going less than 3 times per week or every other day, probably are dealing with some constipation or motility issues. If we're going more than like 3-4 times a day, there might be some exceptions there where if you have an absurdly high caloric intake and your food volume is very, very high and you're a large human being, there is a chance that potentially bowel movements may skew up and down. So understand this is for the average population, but first just think about the rules of threes. This is a general rule of thumb, so understand it's not going to be perfect all the time, but my general rule is I'd like to see daily bowel movements, and then if you're going much less than that, that's concern for constipation. If you're going much more frequently, that might be more on the side of like irritable bowel, almost going a little bit too frequently, or maybe high stress or different things that can be impacting that. Or something's off in terms of fiber and hydration. So definitely pay attention there. Now you can look this up. You can Google this thing called a Bristol stool chart. That's BRISTOL. So Bristol stool chart. And it'll actually give you an image of essentially how well formed your bowel movements should be. And if they're skewed one way or the other, so if they're like super hard to pass, or if they're almost like liquid, those are the two extremes. So you want to pay attention of, okay, where am I kind of landing here? That's something that you can self-assess even without necessarily having an expensive test or something that's, maybe requires, a coach for that potential intervention. Yeah. And then, just basic sort of subjective things like, am I experiencing good digestion? Am I bloated after meals? How do I feel when I eat my food? Do I wake up and have, do I kind of feel good in the morning, or do I feel distended even before any food is coming into the system? Do I get full very early when I'm eating meals? So for example, a meal of normal size that maybe you used to be able to eat the whole thing, and now you feel like you have early satiety and early fullness. That could be an indication, maybe something going on in terms of stomach acid and enzymatic insufficiency. So little basic cues that you can pay attention to. First and foremost, things like bowel movements, gas, bloating. Yeah. Those are a little bit more obvious ones. Then you can zoom in on looking at more biofeedback markers related to gut function. And then there's things that are not necessarily related to toilet talk, but like your brain fog, cognition, impaired recovery. Those might be signs we want to look a little bit deeper at gut health as well. Now, if we've gone through the process of optimizing nutrition, quality of life, stress, nutritional status, and maybe remove some common irritants, or just generally cleaned up the diet from a standard American diet or things that are known to irritate the gut, then if someone's still having issues, you could consider some type of GI test. Beyond that would be, your option. You do a stool test as opposed to some of the other ones are more like urine or serum, which are helpful for hormonal function, but we're probably leaning more towards the stool test here. And right now, in terms of commercial availability, usually that's going to be something like a PCR test for your stool, like a GI map or GI-FX. And so that essentially is just looking at trends in terms of bacteria and what's going on in terms of that commensal bacteria versus the opportunistic bacteria, and assessing overall kind of the environment of the gut. Now, there are a lot of things you can do prior to GI testing, and that's why I always recommend, first looking at food journal, lifestyle, biofeedback, and some of the basic things we mentioned. And if you're working with an experienced coach, they can probably help you improve digestion before moving on to the test. But if the symptoms persist, you can get an additional sort of resource there. Using the test as kind of a tracking tool to measure your progress over time, and just have an idea in terms of general patterns and what might be going on in terms of sort of different symptoms that you're experiencing in terms of your gut health. Gotcha. That was great. I'm actually taking notes. I hope everybody else is taking notes, by the way, because he's a man of many all information, by the way. So I do want you to talk about the drains and charges concept. That was one thing that is relative to what we do. Man. You went into the 2018 archives. I have to, man. Listen, like I said, I told you I've been watching you, Sam. Come on now. People either really, really like it, and they're like, oh, this is super applicable. Like, I'm going to use this with my clients. Yeah. And then there's other people who are like, nah, I'm good. I don't need that. That's too simple. That seems, I'm over it. So I would say, as far as drains and charges, basically the reason I created that is clients don't always understand like big words like sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic, or understanding things like HP axis that we talked about earlier. Yeah. They don't know about cortisol. They don't know about parasympathetic activities, but they understand I got to charge my smartphone every day if I want to use it the next day, right? The battery is drained and then I got to charge it. So I essentially came up with this T column. Like, you could take a piece of paper, fold it in half, and you can sit with your client, whether it's on the phone, on Zoom, texting, whatever you got to do. And you can essentially write on one side, what are things that are essentially draining you from like a stress perspective. This could also be, chronic dieting. This could be intense training. We essentially have this piece of paper folded in half where you can draw a line down the middle. On one side, we've got our drains. The other side, we have our charges. Charges are actually going to be parasympathetic inputs or recovery inputs. So it can vary from person to person. So like maybe for me, I'm really into music, but I wouldn't really want to paint for you. That might actually be kind of stressful for me. I don't think I would want to do it. I might fight back a little bit. But, including that particular charge may help with my stress management practices. If I've been chronic dieting, a reverse diet is a nutritional stimulus that is actually going to be a charge for that person. If I'm overweight or obese, adding more food is not necessarily a charge. So this is where it's very situational and context dependent. For the person that's overweight, they actually need a caloric deficit or a reduction in energy availability to get healthier and move back to homeostasis from a physiological perspective and kind of get their metabolic health on point.
Yeah.
So we can use the drain and charge analysis to have a simple sort of T-column comparison. It's like if you've ever done pros and cons, like you're making the decision, hey, am I going to go buy this new thing? Or do I really, need to go do this? Or I got to have this conversation with this person. What are the pros and cons? So if you understand how to do pros and cons, you understand how to do drains and charges. The biggest thing is looking at the context of the person and thinking about, okay, would higher calories here or this diet change be a positive intervention, or would this potentially be negative? Would more training be good for this person? If they're a couch potato and the only thing they've been doing is watching Netflix for the last 5 years, getting them moving, walking, training more is a charge. But if I have someone who's doing 2-a-days and their overall recovery is very poor and they've been on low calories, I actually may need to give that person a deload, and that deload is actually a charge even though there's less training. So it's all about what is sort of the total body burden that we're experiencing and what specific changes from a coaching perspective are going to alleviate that body burden or move that person in the right direction. So for the lean, overtrained individual, it's emphasizing recovery inputs. For the underactive, overweight individual who's been consuming too many calories or just making poor dietary choices, for them, it's as simple as going for a walk and, maybe eating some good quality foods. So that's how we kind of look at it on paper. And if you tend to overthink things as a coach, it helps you really get grounded in some very basic concepts as far as how things are contributing to client transformation. And I really liked it for clients because as much as I may understand physiology, the endocrine system, advanced nutrition, and things like that, they might not necessarily want to learn that, but they understand a basic concept like, I want to use my phone tomorrow, I'm going to plug it in tonight. So to get their battery to 100%, what do you have to do? Hey, let's prioritize sleep. Let's talk about what are we going to do from a nutritional perspective to kind of even things out so you can train the way that you want to. And that helps to create a little bit more enrollment and buy-in so that when you're making these coaching decisions, they understand why you're doing the things that you're doing in the transformation and hopefully achieve a little bit better adherence that way.
Love it, man. So I guess final thing would be for general clients and athletes out there looking to optimize their performance, optimize their health. What are some basic things they can do? Either, lab testing, things, sleep quality, nutrition. What are some basic things they could do to optimize their life going further?
Sure. So I'm going to separate this a little bit. I think if I only had like 3 to 5 things that I could have lifestyle clients do, it would be centered around daily movement practices like walking and resistance training, prioritizing protein intake. And, I think water is also very important there, but I'm going to assume that that's a given for everybody listening to the show. You already knew that. So we're going to prioritize daily movement in the form of walking. I think resistance training is super important, not just for, aesthetics, but also longevity, resilience, and, especially for women, really good for osteoporosis, osteopenia, and sarcopenia, and protein intake, not only in terms of muscle building, but also appetite management and satiety. I think it helps sort of displace lesser quality calories from other food choices. So definitely a huge fan of protein because it can help us adhere to whatever nutritional protocol that we're on. And when we have it, it can help us sort of buffer against, less favorable food decisions, I would say. So that's kind of my lifestyle client advice. And then everybody, both lifestyle clients and athletes, could be sleeping more. So in terms of athletes and overall optimization recovery, we'll kind of take this to the next level. So I'm going to assume your protein intake is good. You're already probably moving a lot because you're training for sport. So sleep, absolutely essential. Water and electrolyte balance, make sure that protein intake is in a good spot, like we already mentioned, but we can move on to additional sort of more advanced things. So that is where you could consider some serum lab testing, and doing that on, more of a regular basis. So you might want to include, I'm going to rattle off some tests. You can always, get more information on this, or I post a lot about these particular tests if you're interested, but I would definitely recommend, going and getting your blood work at CBC, CMP, full thyroid panel, sex hormones, looking at some inflammatory markers like CRP, your lipid panel, which we talked a little bit about earlier, is your cholesterol and triglycerides. And then things like vitamin D status, super important as well. And then depending on the person, like if we have a hard training female athlete who's experiencing fatigue, or we know that we're working with a vegan or vegetarian client, the iron panel becomes of even more importance, excuse me. So you may want to add in some of those markers as well. Working with an experienced coach or health practitioner is the best way to kind of tailor those serum labs in terms of what's going to be best for you. But everybody should have those fundamental baselines at least on a semi-regular basis to ensure that they have what they need for, optimal decision making for them. But if I had to kind of parse it out into those two layers, I think mostly our lifestyle clients, like those foundations would go a really long way in making, our whole Western world a lot healthier. The biggest thing I see with athletes is, they're training very intensely, but we need to make sure we're also optimizing micronutrient status, we're eating enough, using periodization with our nutrition and training to make sure recovery is in a good spot, and sleep. Because if you're training that intensely, your body's going to get beat up. You need to make sure that you are sleeping adequately, not only for nervous system health, like we talked about earlier in terms of your HPA axis, but also sleep is one of the times where we can modulate inflammation, and really has a lot of other systemic benefits and hormone production as well. So we really want to make sure we're getting that right recipe in terms of training stimulus with the appropriate sleep to put us in the best spot possible, for performance or physique goals.
Perfect. Love it. So Sam Miller Science podcast, FNMS, right, course, which is what I'm on right now. I'm actually doing it.
Even easier to find.
Yeah.
So metabolismschool.com is the FNMS, Functional Nutrition and Metabolism Specialization. That's the easiest place to find that. My personal content, as far as educational material, no cost content, workshops, anything that I share, I'm Sam Miller Science on Instagram. SamMillerScience.com is the personal brand website. And then my podcast is Sam Miller Science, which we're on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon or Audible, all of those main platforms where you would listen to audio content. And then I'll have the book coming out this fall as well. So those are kind of my main places to find me. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, a lot of the content that I share parallels that, even the free content as well, just to be able to dive in there. And then if you're a health professional looking for more information about some of the things we talked about, that's where, Phil has jumped in FNMS and is kind of using that to level up on the nutrition, physiology, hormones, metabolism, and gut health side of things.
Yep, definitely. And I do recommend that, by the way. So make sure if you get Sam on a call, you let him know that I brought you to him.
Yeah, you got to do that. You got to show Phil some love.
Yeah, man. All right, there it is. Make sure you follow this man. Thanks again for watching. See you again next time.